I hope you're not here under false expectations. I simply want to go through, not in great detail, but in some detail, this particular paper by Deleuze, which is called The Fold. And if you had the reading list, you'd know. That's available in English in a magazine called Yale French Studies, number 80. And I just really want to do what the French would call an explication de texte. Just take, some of the interesting and difficult bits and try and make sense of them, and then try and draw some connection between that and architecture. Before I do, I thought I'd show you a picture, though. This is a painter about whom Deleuze writes. Derrida has written a book about this fellow, as has Jean-Luc Nancy, so clearly there's something going on here. I'll show you a couple more. They won't come as a surprise. It's not Twombly. This is perhaps the best one. Now, the reason why this is interesting, it's not simply that Deleuze writes about it. What makes, and this is a fellow called Huntai, Hantai, who's quite a well-known French painter. What is interesting for us is to ask the question, why is this interesting architecturally? And indeed, if there's anything that should prompt our response, your response especially as architects, to this sort of work, is to begin to ask why something is interesting architecturally. Now, what interests us immediately about this is twofold. In the first instance, it is the same surface. You can see it's a crumpled piece of paper that's been written on. But what you begin to notice here is that these folds, literal folds, occur within the same fabric. And I'll keep coming back to this because this is the motif that is going to inform what Deleuze says about the fold, though equally it's going to become interesting, I hope, on Monday of next week at 5 o'clock, when I want to look at Zemper, Kiesler and Knox, for whom the question of the surface becomes the fundamental organizing motif. In addition, it's a surface that on the one level is continuous, but what you have is the discontinuities, the interruptions occur and have as their condition of possibility something like continuity. And that if there is a sort of organizing motif, it's that finitude, this line here, could have been there. In other words, it's a field that could have been interrupted at any point. Its interruption here is the emergence of the finite that has as its condition of possibility finitude, the infinite. And I will come back to it because it's slightly more complicated than that, but that should be the organizing thing prompting your thoughts. Now clearly, if you're interested in urbanism, and you're interested in notions of addition or how to think about the urban field, and how to add something to an urban field, how to cause density within a pre-existing field, instead of simply a logic of addition, you may think of it in terms of a logic of folding. Now what that actually then means will be very specific to one given project as opposed to another. But I'll leave that up there until it melts, because that will give you some sense of what is at stake in trying to think about the fold, not philosophically, not in terms of Deleuze as a philosopher, but in terms of how one would begin to understand this as something that is linked to a prompt for architecture. Now, the paper begins, and indeed I could spend the entire hour and a bit, which I won't, on the first line. He says, the Baroque does not refer to an essence, but rather to an operative function, to a characteristic. Now, if you were a philosopher, just for a moment, what you'd be struck by, for it's a remarkable thing, is the distinction between essence and operative function. And the difference between these two is enormous. It's not simply that they're words. What you have announced here are two different senses of thinking philosophically. Just imagine if we translated this into German for a second, what we'd have is Wesen. What we'd have is the essence. We'd have something that determined philosophy from Hegel through to Heidegger. That Heidegger's main interest is discovering the essence of truth, thinking about what is true essentially. To think philosophically is to discover essences. Now, they're not the essences that are posed within metaphysics, that may be true. Nonetheless, what characterizes philosophy for Heidegger would be to discover what the essence was, to think through the essence of truth, for example. So, announcing that the Baroque does not refer to an essence, a whole area of philosophical inquiry is put to one side immediately. We're not concerned with essential thinking. Okay, if we're not concerned with essential thinking, what are we concerned with? Well, we're concerned with the Baroque understood as an operative function. And again, this becomes fundamentally important. And here, a really interesting link can be drawn not simply within French philosophy between Derrida and Deleuze, but right back to philosophers such as Nietzsche and others, for whom terms mark activity. They mark forms of investigation. They are workful. So immediately then, what becomes interesting is that the Baroque is an operative function. If there is a link between Deleuze and Derrida, it occurs at this particular point. Différence for Derrida is an operative function. The Baroque for Deleuze is an operative function. So how then do we understand what's going on? Before we answer that question, let's run it through once more. In putting aside the question of work, of essences, insisting on work, insisting on productivity, insisting on creativity, what is opened up is, on the one hand, a distancing of certain philosophical concerns and the moving to the fore the question of work. At the same time, however, what is also denied is the idea that the Baroque refers to a historical category. If you've read the text, he'll talk about Mallarmé as a Baroque poet. He'll refer to Hantai almost as a Baroque artist. That the Baroque is robbed of historical specificity. It's no longer simply the 17th century or anything like that. But the Baroque becomes this operative function. It becomes something that is useful. So what does it do? How do we begin to understand that as a piece of work? One last link, as I said, I could spend all the hour and a bit on this first sentence, I won't. The last link is to the other great French philosopher, Georges Bataille. And I'll come back to Bataille at a certain moment. Bataille writes, I think, one of the most least understood but incredibly important architectural texts. And you can tell it's important for architecture because the word architecture does not occur once within it. And it's a text called the Informe, which lamentably is translated into English as the formless. But it's not the informe, it's not the formless, it's the informal. And what becomes interesting as the informal, it's that which is prior to the creation of form. So it's interesting, at a certain moment, Deleuze will say of the fold and the Baroque that it's the informal par excellence. And our problem is how to think a notion of informality. Well, the answer is very simple. You take the IN as a negation, not form. But it's not a negation of form, it's the prior to form. In the same way as the immaterial is not material, nonetheless, as Deleuze and others will concede, there is an immaterial presence in materiality. Now, the informe for Bataille, the immaterial, are all productive terms. They're all prior to form, but therefore we think forming as a process. So what this first sentence then in sum is saying, he says, the Baroque does not refer to an essence, we understand that now, but rather to an operative function. We now understand that it's something useful, it's something that has utility. Now, what is it? He goes on, it endlessly creates folds. It does not invent the thing, there are folds everywhere. Then he goes, last point, the characteristic of the Baroque is the fold that goes on to infinity. and from the beginning it differentiates them along two lines, according to two infinities, as if the infinite had two levels, the coils of matter and folds in the soul. Well, I'm not exactly sure that you know what that means, so I might just move through it rather delicately. Before I do, the characteristic of the fold is the fold that goes on to infinity. Now, this is going to be the motif that really is going to cause the most interest architecturally. Because if something goes on to infinity, it goes on, like me, ad infinitum. The question is, when will he shut up? The question is, when does the fold stop folding and become form? When does the informe interrupt itself to become form? In French it becomes the informe qui forme. At what moment does the informel become form? So while as a generative moment it is absolutely essential to think of anything informal, the informe, the immaterial, as generative, the architectural question is, given we don't want something to unfold ad infinitum, we want materiality, we want things that stand up. The question is, how do we then stop the fold unfolding in order that form take place? Well, we're yet to get to that. What I want to do is explain what is meant by coils of matter and folds in the soul. The example he gives is marble. On the one hand, he talks about it in relation to matter. He says veins, twisted coils of matter which surround the living beings caught in a block, so that a bank of marble is like an undulating lake full of fish. I'll come back to this. Then there's the soul, which he talks about the potential status caught in a block of marble. Now this is very interesting because matter is what we can see as this endless swirl of materials that is just there within a play of marble. The veins running into each other, we can see an endlessness. So it's possible to see within the finite, we can see the infinite. It's in the matter. But then he says about the soul, it's the potential caught in a block of marble. And as soon as we see the word potential, you hear the word potential, the first thing that springs to your mind is the distinction. It's a philosophical distinction, bear with it, between potential and actual being. How do I move from something that is potential to something that is actual? Well, part of the argument is that something releases a potential. Now, Deleuze then refers to a fundamental part of a thinking about the Baroque, and that's the work of the German philosopher Leibniz. Leibniz is the key philosopher of the 17th century. For those of us who are interested in Nietzsche, going back, who are interested in Heraclitus, the central philosopher is Leibniz. Now, why? For the following reason. It's not simply that Leibniz invented calculus. It's not simply that Leibniz was the first one to understand the infinite. Leibniz used, which I may have talked about in the very first lecture, an extraordinary formulation. He came up with the idea of a simple entity, a point, if you like. He called it a monad. And he defined it as multiplicity in unity. When Deleuze writes about the soul as this potential, endless potential in a block of marble, the reference clearly, of the many possible references, is to the Leibnizian idea of multiplicity in unity. However, when Leibniz writes about the monad as multiplicity in unity, what he's talking about fundamentally is that the monad is described in terms of its appetite, its appetition, its desire. It becomes workful, and the monad works by realizing itself. It unfolds. That's why the soul is always described as an infinite series of folds, always unfolding. Now, the notion of a multiplicity in unity and the infinite unfolding of the soul causes us to ask a very simple question. Look, if something simple unfolds ad infinitum, so that in order to describe it, we have to talk, and here just indulge a certain philosophical language for a moment, we have to talk about an ontology of becoming. Instead of the static and the fixed as being central, we have to understand process and movement. We have to understand an unfolding that takes place because of the power of the entity itself. So the multiplicity and unity is continually unfolding. Leibniz will talk about the Latin word is vis, the German word is Kraft. The power of the monad is its substance, its capacity to unfold. Now all this sounds fantastic, and it is, except that a problem emerges, and it's a problem that Leibniz is absolutely aware of. If something unfolds ad infinitum, could I ever have an image of it? Could I ever have a picture of it? Leibniz distinguishes between appetition and perception. The appetition is the desire of the monad to continue to unfold. It's the ontology of becoming. It's the multiplicity and unity continuing to realize itself. Fine. However, at a given point in time, does the monad have a specific quality that I could describe, then represent? Leibniz says it does. He develops this notion of apperception, and where the monad can conceive of itself as having specificity. Now, architecturally, this becomes very interesting, because if something unfolds ad infinitum, if a deformation can go forever, if a point does not mark the singular, but marks, as Leibniz says, the concurrence of an infinite number of lines, at a certain point I want to move from the infinite number of lines and say of it, it's this. I want to see it as having a certain quality. In other words, the opening up of the notion of the fold opens up the relationship between the finite and the infinite. This is an infinite field. This is a finite interruption. This is an infinite field. This is a finite interruption. Now, what's interesting is that within this finite interruption is an infinite field. Within every infinite interruption, there is an infinite field. That's the logic of the fractal. There is always going to be an infinite within the finite. It goes on ad infinitum. Now, that becomes, in philosophical terms, a description of a particular ontological state of affairs. And the word ontological shouldn't frighten us. The word ontological simply comes from the Greek word for being. It means what this most properly is. Ontology is what something is most properly. What this is a site of infinite relatedness. That's its potential. But its potential as a site of infinite relatedness means that at a certain moment we know how to make an addition by further folds, or by recognizing that within a fold there is other possibilities. But at every moment we make decisions that interrupt the infinite field, but they're decisions that are contemporary with that as an organization. Now, this division of the fold into coils of matter and folds in the soul allows us to see in the sway of the marble an infinite range of possibilities. Equally, for the soul, there is an infinite understood as a potential. Now, having made these points, Deleuze then, as you've read the text, you know, goes into a detailed discussion of Leibniz and tries to bring out a series of important aspects of Leibniz's philosophy. Now, in order to develop these, I want to contrast what he says about Leibniz to something he says about Descartes, because this will open it up for us, because Descartes is sort of easy. Deleuze, writing about Leibniz and Descartes, says this: "It is undoubtedly Descartes' mistake to have thought that the real distinction between parts entailed separability. What defines an absolute fluid is precisely the absence of coherence or cohesion, that is to say, the separability of parts, which is only applicable to abstract or passive matter." Now, blah, blah, blah. What does that mean? "It is undoubtedly Descartes' mistake to have thought that the real distinction between parts entailed separability. a real distinction would be, let's take the most elementary elements of architecture, the most fundamental things, and I keep talking about them. There's one, you've got to do this. This is one, we call this a wall. This is a wall, this is a floor. This guy down here is the corner. This and this are discontinuous because there's a corner. We think these as having to be separate. The mark of the separation is the tyranny of the corner. Now, if we were Cartesian, we'd say, look, we've got element A, element B, you add them together, you've got A and B, and you've got this magical thing called a corner. But we think them discontinuously. Now, therefore, if we flip this into Descartes' mistake, it's so wonderful when Deleuze writes, it is undoubtedly Descartes' mistake, to have thought that the real distinction between parts entailed separability. So this is thought as separate. So it's thought in terms of a logic of addition. I add these two together. Go back to Hunter. Let's think about this architecturally, because that's the job. Just forget the philosophy. Let's think architecturally. Okay, how can we do this? Floor, 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 flip, 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 wall, second floor. Goes floor, wall, second floor. All a singular line. Continuity. But continuity generating discontinuity. In other words, I don't think of a logic of A, B, C, a logic of addition. What I think of is interconnectedness. Now, clearly, this is not architecture. This is a folded piece of paper on which some fellow has written some words. But forget that. Think of its architectural potential. We don't have the discontinuity of the wall and the floor. And think about it. We've got the floor, the wall, then we've got the ceiling, which magically becomes another floor with a little space between it. But we think in terms of discontinuity. There's a very interesting German architect called Dagmar Richter who recently took the Maison Domino and ran it through Maya and lofted between them. In other words, tried to show in what sense you could even turn that into a continuous surface. So we have a logic of addition. It dominates the frame. It dominates our thinking about modern architecture. It's not as though we have to build literal folds. That would be the naive approach to Deleuze that happened in the 80s. What's interesting is we think about notions of continuity as generating discontinuity. So we don't make Descartes' mistake, which was to have thought, as I said, that a real distinction between parts entailed separability. That distinction is always the result of an infinite process generating conceptions of finitude. So the great challenge, let's pretend we're in the 17th century. We've got the French in one corner, Germans in the other, we've got Descartes over here, we've got Leibniz over here, sort of like wrestling from women in love. What would be a wonderful thing to imagine? What would be interesting would be to see that the Cartesian mistake is not simply to have separability, but it's to think a notion of the point as absolute simplicity. That a point marks no more than itself. I join one point to another, and I join two simples. Leibniz, as I've said to you before, defines the point as that through which there is a concurrence of an infinite number of lines. In other words, any point marks both an infinite, but equally the potential for finitude. But finitude always occurs by the interruption of the infinite, by allocating to the infinite a certain potential, i.e. it's this point here now. That's why the point and the monad are ontologically the same. They're both multiplicity in unity. And it is an extraordinary thing to think about. I mean, if you think about it in terms of what a self is, what a human being might be, we say, well, I'm only one thing. You're not. You're a play of forces, a site of possibilities. The notion of a multiplicity and unity can run both from conceiving of a point or a monad to conceiving of the self. But more about that later. The next part of where he talks about, he says, it's undoubtedly Descartes' mistake to have thought that the real distinction between parts entails separability, which is the logic of addition. He then goes on, what defines an absolute fluid is precisely the absence of coherence or cohesion, that is to say, the separability of parts, which is, now, therefore, if we want to think of this as a continuous surface, we cannot think of it in terms of a separability of parts which then get to be added. Therefore, if we think about this architecturally as a architectural diagram, and it's not, it's a crumpled piece of paper, but if we thought about this as an architectural diagram, our problem would be how to individuate within it. And this is a dreadful word, but the word individuate is fundamental to thinking about this as a process. There's another French philosopher that Deleuze gets a lot of this work from on individuation, who's a fellow called Georges Simondon, Simondon, who was the first real theorist of individuation. And what he was interested in is how a system, an organizational system, allows particularity to emerge. How does a system account for something particular? Given that the world is not a series of particulars added together, how does a system individuate? So that would be the question then that comes out of this. It's not a question of building this, it's a question saying that this is a diagram, this is a system, therefore the problem is how does this as a system individuate elements where we don't see the individuation of elements within a logic of addition? How does that work? How do we have specific things? Well, what I want to talk about next on Monday, though I'll mention it here now, is that if you think about the notions of a surface, there are two ways of thinking of these things, these windows here, doors, these doors. And that's this way, that you have this surface here, and we can develop a sort of mathematical description of this surface and give it a description. Then you've got this, which is an interruption of that surface. I punch a hole through. The logic of punching, as it were, and the logic of creation are fundamentally different. What becomes interesting, it's the potential both in Deleuze and in Leibniz, but equally in Maya, the other great French philosopher, is that what will allow for is the idea that fenestration and entrance and exit occur because of the way in which the program allows it. In other words, instead of a logic that's different from the logic that creates the wall, the logic that creates the window or fenestration or entrance and exit, it can be an effect of the actual creation of the surface. Now, it's very intriguing when Deleuze goes on to, dealing with Leibniz. He actually, I'll cut to this because it's absolutely fascinating. It's as though Deleuze knew about Maya a long time ago. He says, the facade, can have doors and windows. It is full of holes, although there is no such thing as an empty space. And he goes on, this is the bit. A hole being no more than the site of a more subtle matter. It's as though that at a certain moment the logic of construction thins so dramatically that what you have is a hole. But the hole is not altered. It does not occur by interrupting the logic of construction. It's already there in the logic of construction. In other words, we see something as discontinuous as a window as continuous with the construction of the surface. And it's very intriguing to see in what sense this idea of fenestration, which is such a boring thing to talk about, the making of windows, but the idea of fenestration could be implicit in a logic that creates a surface. I'll come back to this point because I think it's a remarkable moment in which we see something like a logic of addition vanishing, and yet we can still have that which is radically discontinuous with fullness, namely a hole, which we call an architectural window. So we know what Descartes' mistake was. Now, contrary to Descartes, there is dear old Leibniz, who thinks in radically different sorts of ways. Now, Deleuze, for Leibniz, according to Deleuze, and I quote, the labyrinth of continuity is not a line which would dissolve into independent points. So the labyrinth of continuity, which continually individuates smaller and smaller elements, which themselves potentially individuate other elements. So I go into a labyrinth, I go into one hole, I open, I see other holes, I go into any other one, there are further holes, etc., etc. The labyrinth of continuity, he says, is not a line which would dissolve into independent parts. Again, this is the virtue of this, which I'll be here all evening. Again, you can see in what sense automatically. The labyrinth of continuity is not a line which would dissolve into independent parts. But you don't get pure flatness. You get still individuation. The labyrinth of continuity is not a line which would dissolve into independent parts like sand flowing in grains, but is like pieces of a fabric or a sheet of paper which divides into an infinite number of folds. But it doesn't divide into an infinite number of folds. It potentially divides into an infinite number of folds. Or disintegrates in curved moments, each determined by the consistency or the participation of its setting. Now, we need to wrestle with this. We need to take Deleuze absolutely seriously, and not just sort of flippantly, but absolutely seriously. Because he's right. The labyrinth of continuity is not a line which would dissolve into independent points. We know this. Whoops. What have I done? I've killed it. No, I haven't. We know this. It doesn't divide into independent points. Right. Like sand flowing grains, but is like a piece of fabric or a sheet of paper which divides into an infinite number of folds. Well, actually, it doesn't divide into an infinite number of folds. Its potential is to divide into an infinite number of points. That's why I highlighted the bit earlier, where Deleuze talks about matter and talks about the potential infinite. And it seems to me what's so important is to recognize this distinction between potentiality and actuality. This is potential infinite because it's not a flat surface. That would be to misunderstand the surface's construction. I can alter all the bits around it and fold it ad infinitum, but at any one moment it's not folded ad infinitum. At any one moment it has finitude. So we need then to wrestle with the idea that it's absolutely right to think of continuity as that which is not independent points, that is infinite in potential, and then work out how, as architects, you can think the distinction between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. Sorry, and something that's actual. A potential infinite, and then something that comes to realize itself. Why would we need to do this? Well, a potential infinite is of necessity informal. It's informel. It's prior to form. What architecture is concerned with is form. Therefore, what we need to work out is how we move from the inform to the form, from the informel to the formel, from the potential infinite to finitude. The Cartesian mistake would be to see that finitude is simply the addition of A to B to C, which can go on ad infinitum. So you keep adding things and you get a logic of addition to infinity. Here, and if you go back to school, imagine you're a schoolboy or a schoolgirl or whatever one you want. Remember calculus? Remember the sort of funny shaped S, and you put sort of numbers at the top and numbers at the bottom? You could have infinite variation with calculus, but at any moment you had to fix the parameters. Once the parameters are fixed, then there's infinite, but it's always internal. And it's this internality that is actually what Leibniz is talking about. So when he says that the monad is multiplicity in unity, it means that within any delimited domain, there is an infinite field of possibility. Now, it's not truly infinite, it's potentially infinite. You can't have an infinite number of folds because you can't have an infinite number of folds. What you can have is an infinite potential to have an infinite number of folds. But any one fold precludes another fold. Therefore, there can never be actually an infinite number of folds, only ever potentially. And that's the consequence of this. So Deleuze, of course, is absolutely right about the independent points. We in the realm of architecture, have to worry about the move from the infinite to the finite. Now, there's a particularly interesting moment when Deleuze actually engages with Leibniz himself. And he quotes from Leibniz. I just want to read you the quote from Leibniz. Leibniz says, the division of the continuous... wrong, sorry. That was the Leibniz file. I'll read it again. The division of the continuous ought not to be considered as that of sand into grains, but as that of a sheet of paper or a tunic into folds, in such a way that there can be infinite number of folds, one smaller than the next, without the body ever dissolving into points or minima. Again, this is the reiteration of, this is the Leibnizian point, re-articulated by Deleuze. The struggle again, and Deleuze is absolutely consistent in the dealing with Leibniz, the challenge always is to work out how one moves from the infinite to the finite. Now, having discussed Leibniz, and having discussed something that's the 17th century, having discussed something that's purely Baroque, in the historical sense, he flips around. We move from the discussion of Baroque to the discussion of Jackson Pollock and Robert Rauschenberg, as though that's not a problem, because it isn't. What you have in Pollock is, for Deleuze, a line of infinite inflection. And again, what we see, imagine you see a Pollock painting, Lavender Mist in Washington, or wherever one you want. What you see is a site of infinite relatedness. There is no central line running through it that determines everything else. There are a series of lines, all generative of infinite relatedness. In other words, if you, I don't have one, but you could imagine a Jackson Pollock up here. At any point, there would be a potential infinite in relation to any other point. And that point has an infinite relationship to any other point. It's exactly the same argument as you get with the labyrinth. As you go into the labyrinth, there's a room. You go into the room, there's an infinite number of rooms. You go into each one of those rooms, there's an infinite number of rooms, etc., etc. There is no constraint, no holding. There is always an infinite of possibility, an infinite of relatedness. Looking at a Jackson Pollock painting, thinking about the line of infinite inflection, what one begins to recognize is it's not simply inflected in that way. There is an infinite of relatedness. One can move from one point to any potential point. Therefore, I mean, just to talk art history for a sort of a nanosecond, art is so dominated by a notion of opticality in which the eye is always drawn in to something. Classical art is always about, if you think about Poussin, you look at a Poussin painting and your eye is drawn to the focal point, and then the eye moves out. And in moving out, you move along a line of relation. But it's dominated by the focal point. If you think of dear old, wonderful French painter, David, that extraordinary painting about Brutus having had his sons murdered for being unpleasant. And you look at the painting, and because of the way David uses light and shadow, your eye goes immediately to the mother, who's quite rightly traumatized by the death of her sons, and she is in light. And then you move, then the eye moves immediately to Brutus, who sits in shadow. And it's extraordinarily powerful for that very reason. But what makes the painting work is that you can only see the mother first and the sisters, but they're in light and they're in white dresses. So the eye goes immediately to them, and only then can you possibly see Brutus. So the power of the painting is the way in which it controls the eye. There is not an infinite of relatedness in classical painting. The use of light or shadow, the use of focal points, always controls the movement of the eye. What makes Pollock so interesting is that notion of control has vanished. Therefore, there is no moment in which the eye rests and then moves out. There is no one moment that has focal centrality. The eye falls there and can move out and relates to anywhere. The eye falls here and relates to anywhere. If we were to do a map of a Poussin painting, it would be very clear. You would start with the focal point, you've got the focal point here, and then you'd move out to all the other characters, and you could draw a map exactly of that. It would be very easy to draw. Classical painting you can map without it being a problem, because that's the way the eye works. With this, in regards to Pollock, what would be a Pollock map? And the answer would be, it's exactly the same as the argument about the finitude. A map of a Pollock painting would be an attempt to chart one way through it. And that one way through it would have as its condition of possibility that there were an infinite number of other maps. And what would be the important point is that creating one map would preclude the creation of another map. So it becomes, I think, I mean, Deleuze doesn't say this, but I think it's a very interesting point one could say in addition, that what this gives you, this creation, In regard to describing a Poussin painting, a classical painting, there isn't a decision being made. There is simply a description of the way the eye is constrained to work by the way the painting works. It's a constraint. That's what has to happen. So there's not really a decision. It's just following the logic of the eye. In regard to Pollock, however, my decision to map it this way rather than that way is precisely a decision. Precisely because there were other possibilities, other mappings that could take place, one mapping in precluding another, one conception of finitude in precluding another, gives you what philosophically one would want to call a logic of decision. In other words, the decision to do something, and therefore to be responsible for that action, takes as its condition of possibility a finite act where there always could have been another. In other words, that the map of Pollock depends upon an infinite of relatedness. It's depending upon an infinite relatedness means that this description, in precluding that description, is that for which I am responsible, because it's a decision. And so I think that built into all this discussion of the infinite, and therefore the need to come to finitude all the time, has built into it not an ethics, that would make it banal, but a logic of decision, and therefore a notion of responsibility. So that the move to form can't simply be haphazard. The move to form is one way of negotiating the informel that differs from another. So when Deleuze goes on and talks about Leibniz talks about Pollock and Rauschenberg, it's both in terms of this infinite of relatedness, but equally in terms of a complex surface. I mean, I don't know how much you know, so it doesn't matter. But imagine a Rauschenberg canvas in which you have all manners of things put on the top. You have paint, you have objects, you have this or you have that. If you don't want to think about that, think about this wonderful woman whose name is Jessica Stockholder, who's a painter. Why is she a painter? Because it looks like sculpture. It's a painter. I'll be Jessica Stockholder for a minute. Always wanted to be Jessica Stockholder. You see these three things here? These are three objects, okay? Now, they're sculpture at the moment, but I have in my hand a bucket of red paint and a brush, and I draw a line that goes across all three of them. What have I done? I've turned three separate objects into a surface. I've created a painting by refusing the Cartesian logic of addition. This is not A plus B plus C. The line that I've drawn, the coloured line that I've drawn over these three, refuses sculpture and is the creation of painting. Because I then could say, you'd say, but hold on, these three are three elements, you can't do that. And I say, the surface predominates, the continuity predominates, the individual elements you see, you sad Cartesian, are simply there because they form the basis of my desire to establish an interplay of continuity and discontinuity. That's what Rauschenberg is doing. That allows you to create a surface that, while moving, while not flat, while projective, the use of colour, just like my drawing a red line across these three guys, makes them continuous, and in making them continuous is the condition for identifying their individuality. That was my little Jessica Stockholder moment. What's interesting then is that the notion of a surface draws these elements together. What you have is this line of infinite inflection, this line of infinite relatedness, this idea of establishing a surface, and that's what this is. And that's why this will stay here. If you think about these as radically dissimilar elements, they get to be made similar by the use of a continuous surface, by the writing as being at least visually continuous. So all of a sudden, we now begin to understand what is meant by the fold as an operative function. It's both a way of understanding the creation of things, but equally it's a way of interpreting things. There's something absurd in the idea that Pollock is a Baroque painter. It's just counterintuitive. Unless you then go and say, well, hold on, let's think about Poussin and Pollock. And when we think about Poussin and Pollock, we see the tyranny in small t, very soft, limp tyranny, but the tyranny of classical painting, which is a tyranny I personally adore, a tyranny versus this sight of infinite relatedness. They're not simply two different strategies of painting, they demand two different ways of being understood. In other words, were one to ask the question, sure, it's a painting, but how is it a painting? Then what you would do is go to the eye, which is the thing we'd use for looking at art, believe it or not. When it comes to Poussin, what we see is given. When we look at Pollock, there is nothing given to be seen. There is a sight of infinite possibility. Within that, I intervene and say, well, I particularly like that point there. I want to move it down to here, blah, 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 blah. In other words, that my description of its work as painting has to concede that any description is one finite possibility, which is precisely the opposite to looking at classical painting, especially 17th century, early 18th century French painting, in which the focal point is so dominant, there is a finite series of things to say, which has finitude as its condition of possibility, as opposed to an infinite number of finite things to say, which has the infinite's condition of possibility. So it's two different ways of seeing it. The Pollock is inherently Baroque once you understand it in these terms. Now, so I'm only just beginning to get into this, so bear with me. It's quite exciting, I think. I mean, there's a lot there. That's why the thing is, it's not to get hung up and let's all be Deleuzian, to actually realise that there are some really important issues here, though for architecture there are some real limitations. And the real limitations is the failure to think through what finitude would mean in material architectural terms. But let me go on. He then, shock upon shock, he defines Baroque architecture as this. Baroque architecture can be defined by the scission, the separation, of the facade and the inside, of the interior and the exterior, the autonomy of the interior and the independence of the exterior, affected in such a way that each one sets off the other. Well, if you were here on Monday, Tuesday, whenever I showed you the Borromini slide, you'll know exactly what this means. But then, does he tell you that Borromini is the example of Baroque architecture? No, there's only one clear Baroque architect, and that's Leurs. You hadn't realised this. I'll explain to you why Leurs is a Baroque architect, in case you wanted to know. The reason why is this. Firstly, you stand in front of the Villa Müller, worth doing, because it's a cool villa. What can you see? You can see a facade. You can see an outside. Now, most of us, because we've hung around architecture schools for perhaps far too long, can begin to see the inside from the outside. Just go and stand in Bedford Square, look at the outside of a building, you can see the front door, and you think, well, behind that are the stairs, they'll go up, they'll loop around, then there'll be a room here and a room here, then the stairs will loop again, and there'll be, you can read the inside from the outside. It's not a problem. You can't do this with the Villa Müller. If you try and read the inside from the outside, you would go mad. Because you can't, that's one of the difficulties in photographing it. You cannot read the inside from the outside. What does that tell you? First thing, the outside is, the exterior wall is a surface that is independent in relation to the interior. It is not structurally independent, but it's independent vis-a-vis its being a surface. Now, okay, you flip on the inside. How does the inside of the Villa Müller work? Well, you know the answer. It works because of the relationship between the Raumplan and the Bekleidung, the volumetric interpenetration and juxtaposition, orchestrated by the cladding. Not orchestrated by the walls, but orchestrated by the stuff on the walls, which is, of course, the real wall, namely the cladding. Not the hard stuff, but the cladding. In other words, it operates by volumetric juxtaposition articulated through the cladding. That's the way it works. That's how you can have ambulatory and sedentary subjects. That's the way you can have the effect of a wall, i.e. spatial division, without there having to be an actual wall. You drop down and walk above, and it's extraordinary the way it operates. Now, there is simply one major thing going on within the Villa Müller, or the Villa Moller, whichever one you want, and that is that circulation is driven by the relationship between volume and cladding. That's how the surface operates in the Villa Müller. It's all about the work of the surface. But hold on, you think. There's another surface called the exterior wall. What's that exterior surface? The answer is that it's indifferent to the interior surface. It's a building that has two surfaces which are functionally distinct. They are functionally indifferent. Sure, they're held up by solid things, but they're two different sort of surfaces. Deleuze is absolutely right. There is a distinction between the facade and the inside, the interior and the exterior. Whether or not that makes Leurs a Baroque architect, you're wiser than I am, I will leave that to you. But what becomes interesting is that when we move to the idea of a surface, carrying these possibilities, not only can we see links between Zempa and Leurs, as I've argued over this place for years, what becomes more interesting is if you took Leurs and thought about the diagram and flipped it on its side, then you could run a surface that had two completely distinct elements. And as it moved and operated, you'd have the articulation of distinct architectural possibilities held by the one structural member called the surface. If you want an example of that, you look at the Ben van Berkel's Moebius house. You see in what sense a continuous surface, not an egg surface, but a surface that's got at least two curves, that's at least two curves, as a bottom line, two curves. What you then have is the articulation of completely different independent architectural possibilities. That doesn't make Ben van Berkel's Moebius house Baroque architecture. It simply indicates that there is an interesting affinity. Can you hear something? Vis-a-vis the question of the surface between Borromini, Zempa, Leurs. You can theorize this a la Deleuze if you wish in terms of the Baroque. You don't have to. What becomes just as interesting to my mind is what's here is the notion of a surface linked to the idea of a double curve. And the surface as having a double curve is not inherently Baroque, except that there's always an infinite that interrupts itself by individuating elements. The key thing is to see this as a continuous line, then you double it, hence Moebius house, but as a continuous line where each of these elements is individuated by the work of the line, rather than a series of lines that are thought as distinct, that individuate nothing other than themselves. So what we get then in this description of Baroque architecture is the possibility of drawing interesting connections that are not visual. This is the point. They're not visual between Borromini, Leurs, and others, mediated by Zempa as the theorist, the real true theorist of the surface. We can see affinities that are not visual. Therefore, what sort of affinities are they? Well, you can either run the Deleuzian line and say, well, they're to do with the Baroque as an operative function, or you could run another line, which these lines abut, as always, to say that actually what's going on here is a complex diagram of the surface. And these two things clearly inform and mediate each other. But it's not simply the Baroque, and therefore, not that I want to have reservations about Deleuze, it's not my place so to do, I know my place, but what would be interesting would begin to question whether or not the Baroque as an operative function actually forms part of a larger philosophical or architectural theoretical project, and that is to see that relationships individuate, that surfaces carry program, that surfaces are always more complicated than simple flatness and simple straightness. But nonetheless, let's stay with it, Baroque architecture is this for him, this schism of the facade and the inside, the interior and the exterior. There is therefore an autonomy between the levels. However, the question of autonomy really does open up such interesting possibilities in working out how you would begin to understand. And this is, I think, again, where architecturally one could begin to just to question slightly the Deleuzian formulation, because if the inside and the outside are independent, if the facade, the interior and the exterior are autonomous in relation to each other, why is that not discontinuity rather than continuity? So there may be ways of beginning to think about there needs to be an extra question of relatedness brought in. But anyway, he then talks about other notions of ways of understanding the Baroque and gives further examples to make us understand what's going on. I won't pursue it, but there's a fascinating discussion just in passing of the French 19th century poet Mallarmé, early 20th century poet Mallarmé, who on one level simply cannot be a Baroque poet because it just doesn't work their way. And yet, Mallarmé writes literally about the pli, about the fold, and is about the infinite number of folds. He uses this pli, and then Boulez, the great French 20th century composer, composed a work called what? Pli selon pli, fold according to fold. In other words, what Deleuze is, keeps bringing us back to, at a very minimal level, is that the motif of the fold, the motif of, if you like, a complexity of infinite relatedness, is there within and as a countermeasure to notions of fixity, notions of the static, notions of the singular point. They exist as much in Boulez's music as they do in Leurs' architecture. There's no way that you could begin to think of Boulez as a composer on the one hand and Leurs as an architect on the other. How could there be a connection between them? And yet precisely because the notion of the fold allows a connection to be drawn, we can begin to see it. But what we're seeing is never visual. You can't visually see it. It's not auditory. You can't hear it. It's simply philosophical or intellectual, namely that there are organizing motifs which will lend themselves to the creation of fixed and static points, but where fixity is the arrest of movement. The example I used a number of times with you already, and I'll make it for the last time, trust me. When Perrin writes about the origin of towns and says that towns occur where two trade routes intersect, I mean, let's assume this is true. The argument is that fixity is the arrest of movement. In other words, there is a potential in the movement of trade routes at a certain constellation, a certain set of forces comes to play, and you have a town. You don't have a point and you draw a line between them. You have two lines that intersect, that weave around, and at certain moments, either adjacency or whatever, will give you a thing called a town called fixity. And that town will attract further movement to it. So fixity and points are always the result of the cessation of movement. They're never given in advance and you move between them. It's obvious if you think about it historically. Towns emerge because of trade routes. I mean, if you think of the development of any coast, it's very intriguing in Australia where I live. No one seems to quite understand why the railway line doesn't work properly on the east coast, where it should work. There should be connections between the towns. By rail, it's sort of obvious. And why isn't it true? Why can't you join these dots? Well, the reason why was that those towns actually were served by boats, and that all the transport up and down the east coast of Australia was by movement, but it was the movement of boats. So each little town is perfectly structured around trade and goods and people being brought in by hundreds of little steamboats and ferry boats that used to ply up and down the east coast, trading goods and people, etc. And at a certain moment, and you could see all the little points along the east coast as the consequence of movement up and down by boats. All of a sudden, boats no longer exist. So they become random points, and you can't explain how to connect them. The reason why is you forget they are the consequence of movement, but it was movement that was external to land, it was on water. Trying to join them up by railway lines didn't work. They weren't created to be connected by railway lines, but by water. The point remains that finitude is always the result of an infinite series of relations. Now let me just go on a little bit further into this. He then talks about, in more detail, the operational concept of the Baroque. And I think we now know enough to understand why it's not historical, why it's not to do with the essence, but is operational. Now, in the last section of the paper, and I want to leave to one side the discussion of Tintoretto and El Greco, because I think that there's a great deal of debate as to whether or not El Greco is truly a Baroque painter. It's very interesting if you just to pause. The other thing historically that's taken to characterize the Baroque is something to do with the secular, or something worrying about the role of religion. There's a wonderful Caravaggio painting that's called, I think, The Identification of St. Matthew, or one of the saints, one of the Christian saints. And there are these sort of, blokes playing cards the way blokes do, and there are some glasses of wine, and they're fleshy and they just look like you and me, except they're blokes. And they're chatting, and you can just see this is a completely domestic secular scene. And someone bursts in and points to this really dissolute fellow, and it's called The Identification of St. Mark, or St. Matthew, one of them. And what's interesting about that is that here you have Caravaggio giving you the secular Baroque, that it's all about the human. This is a standard historical interpretation. El Greco's saints are not like that. El Greco's saints are austere, they're religious, they don't look like we look, they're not human at all, they're saintly. And so I think there's a real problem, to my mind at least, in seeing El Greco as Baroque in that sense at all. Or if he is, I then worry very much as to what Caravaggio would be like. But I don't want to nitpick over those sorts of points. What I want to do is get to the very last part of the paper of Deleuze, where he gives a sort of summing up. The last 5 or 6 pages gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is what the Baroque is. This is what the fold is. He starts the section called The Fold, and he defines it just perfectly. The Baroque invents the infinite work or operation. We've seen this, infinite work or operation. We've seen Leibniz, the point, the concurrence of an infinite number of lines. Leibniz, multiplicity and unity. The Baroque invents the infinite work or operation. Unequivocal, absolutely right. Then he says, and this I think is the real challenge for architecture, the problem is not how to finish a fold, but how to continue it, make it go through the roof, take it to infinity. For the fold affects not only all kinds of materials, which thus become matter of expression in accordance with different scales and speeds and vectors, but it also determines and brings form into being and into appearance. It makes of it a form of expression. Now I want to sort of, as always, as is my wont, to say yes and no. Yes, it's right to think of infinite relations. However, and I'd leave you with this question, but I won't leave you, I'll just leave posed. Do you think architecturally the problem is not how to finish a fold, but how to continue it to make it go through the roof, to take it to infinity? Or do you think architecturally the question is precisely how to finish a fold, how to arrest its movement, how to move to form? Now, let me run this 2 ways. The risk in not doing that, in thinking about cessation as important, is what one could end up with is a type of formalism. In other words, where what one saw on the screen and what came to be built would be one and the same. There wouldn't be any transformative moments. It would simply be a continuity between a formal presence on a screen and the creation of that as an architectural edifice. On Monday, when I talk about the work of Knox, I'll try and explain how Knox as a group, Lars Spybrook as an architect, systematically avoids that as a possibility by having a more complex series of form creation. But if we just ran the fold ad infinitum, what appeared on the screen would be extend, and we'd end up with a type of formalism. So it may be that the question of avoiding formalism is to work out not simply how to finish a fold, but how to give that which is a fold, whether it's this or whether it's something on a screen, actual architectural expression. Maybe we just take it as architects. Maybe we just build this. You remember there was that book years ago called Folding in Architecture. You suddenly realized that what folding in architecture meant was literally folded things. I mean, Deleuze knows better than that. If the fold is not literal, what is the fold? And in architecture, if the fold is not literal, what is folded architecture? Now, that goes back to where I started all these lectures about the problem of appearance, the problem of how we understand the problem of the modern. But if it's not literally folded, what is the fold in architecture? And I would argue that it actually has to do with allowing there to be continuous lines that individuate elements. So we're always talking about the movement from the infinite to the finite. We're always talking about a continuous line that allows for elements. For example, a surface that at one moment is floor, then becomes furniture, then becomes wall, then becomes roof, then flips around and becomes an upstairs room, but thought of as the operation of a continuous surface. So it's never just surface, it's both surface and floor, a furniture, wall, window, etc., etc. All part of the movement of a singular line, but allowing for individuation to occur as a consequence. So you don't run it to infinity, you run it to the point in which elements come to be individuated by the process. So my reservation, therefore, is it's not to do with literal folds, but it's to allow the idea that continuity is that which generates discontinuity. Furniture is discontinuous with walls, but they arise out of a continuity. Windows are discontinuous with walls, which are discontinuous with floors, but they arise out of a continuity. And that's the challenge in thinking architecturally the fold as an operative function rather than simply as literally folded. And it's another topic, therefore I won't pursue it in great detail, but the great problem in all of this stuff in architectural terms, whether it's Derrida's notion of deconstruction or Deleuze's notion of the fold or Greglin's notion of the blob or whatever it is to take it literally. You know, in the 80s, deconstructive architecture was stuff that was deconstructed and stuck back together again. In the 80s, folded architecture was literally folded. You could see the folds. Blobs, hélas, are literally blobs. But if we read deconstruction, the fold and the blob as a diagram, not as a literal piece of broken stuff or squidgy stuff, and I use these words architecturally, but actually as diagrams for the generation of something, then the fold needn't look folded. The blob needn't look blobby, or maybe it would. Deconstruction needn't look broken. Therefore, it's never a question of the literal enactment or representation, but of seeing these things diagrammatically. And once they're seen as diagrammatically, then they can never be run ad infinitum. The move from the diagram, as I said a few days ago, to its enactment is to view the diagram, this goes back to where we started, as the potential generator of representations. But the move to representation, what we old-fashioned people call plan and section, arises out of the diagram, where the diagram is a site of infinite possibility. But that infinite possibility is, for whatever reasons, interrupted and finitude emerges. Now, when I talk on Monday at 5 o'clock, what I'm going to try and develop is, in relation to the work of Zemper and Kiesler, is what I would call the material event. Not the material girl, but the material event. The material event is an interplay between geometry, program, and materials that allows absolutely for the infinite, but always sees in that interconnection of the three the move to form. So a material event is always informal precisely because it's a site of research and investigation. It's a site of research and investigation that holds to, as we must, the autonomy of architecture, but allows that autonomy to be mediated by the notion of program as a site of information. As I keep saying to you, and like I said one more time after that white wine is clearly the order, is that for architects, space does not exist. Bottom line, there is no such thing as space. Walls create space. Surfaces space, their activities. Therefore we ask the question, not about space in abstraction, because that's uninteresting. What is the quality of the space created by this wall, or that wall? What is the quality of space created by two exterior walls in an urban field? Given that space is created, what is created is a space that is always informed. What it's informed by is program. That's what architecture does. It creates space that is informed by program. Even if that program is, well, let's see what it's like to program it in 10 years' time, that's the program. It's not as though it's empty, existing in vacuo. It awaits. And that awaiting is a programmatic possibility. It's not simply the fact that it's empty. So the material event, therefore, I will try and argue this on Monday at 5 o'clock, becomes a way of beginning to think about these three things interconnecting. So Deleuze is absolutely right to say that the Baroque invents the infinite work or operation. I, for what it's worth, would want to worry that the problem is not to let it flow, but exactly the question is how to finish it. And therefore the question in architecture is, how do you finish a fold? You finish a fold by differentiating it from the literal. It's not literally folded, that finishes it immediately, but sees interconnectedness between program materials and geometry as a site. Last moments. Gosh. He then goes on to look at other aspects of the fold and talks about the interior and the exterior. And he says this, and it's quite extraordinary. The infinite fold separates or passes between matter and the soul, the facade and the sealed room, the interior and the exterior. For the line of inflection is a virtuality ceaselessly differentiating itself. Actualized in the soul, it is realized in its own way in matter. He goes on then to talk about Leurs. And I think, there's an issue here which I won't pursue, but it's very interesting that on one hand you want to argue that, well, do you? This is the question. That in the Leucian villa, the distinction between the inside and the outside as separate, is that a condition that's given by the wall as differentiating it, or is it simply that the wall is that which holds these two different things together? And an enormous amount hangs on this. He says the infinite fold separates or passes between matter and the soul, the facade and the sealed room, and then cites Leurs in order to make this point. And it seems to me that if we are interested in Leurs, and I'm afraid I'm a Leurs obsessive, it would be very interesting to begin to run Deleuze's reading of Leurs versus Beatrix Colomina's reading of Leurs, the Freudian reading of Leurs that sees the outside as the face, the inside as the unconscious, and you can't move from one to the other, while Deleuze thinks you can move from one to the other. To see Leuce's villas as a site in which differing philosophical and historical and psychoanalytic ways of understanding the surface can come to be played out. Now, the last moment was this, where he talks about, this is the point I wanted to make, the Baroque is the preeminent informal art. On the ground, at ground level, at hand, it comprises the textures of matter. Then he says, and this is the beautiful part, but the informal is not the negation of form. Absolutely true. It posits form as folded, as existing only as a mental landscape, in the soul or the mind, at height. It thus includes immaterial folds as well. The kinds of matter constitute the base, but the folded shapes are its forms. Again, if this were a discussion of Leibniz, it would be absolutely true. That it's absolutely true philosophically to argue that form is posited as folded. But then he says, as existing only as a mental landscape in the soul. It's absolutely right. In the monadology, Leibniz says that the soul is, he says contains, but let's just change the translation to is an infinite number of folds. That's what the soul is. So it's absolutely right to argue that the informal is not the negation of form, it posits form as folded ad infinitum. Our question is the question I want to end on, again, is that whilst that's true as a philosophical description of the infinite, as not the infinite of addition, but the infinite that's always internal, the folded infinite, our question is, what architecturally do we then do with that? How do we take Leibniz's conception of the soul as a virtual infinite, because it's virtually infinite, and think of it as materially infinite? In other words, how do we think about a virtual infinite as having material presence? And it seems to me that one of the most interesting philosophical and architectural problems that arises out of all of this is not the question of being dismissive of this at all, because there's so much of it that's absolutely rich. The question with which architecture has to struggle in order to avoid the lapse into formalism on the one hand, or to avoid the problem of the literal on the other. My algorithm gave me this and now it's architecture, boom, as though it were that easy. To see in what sense there's always got to be a move to form. And ironically, that's exactly what Leibniz would want to say, that at a certain moment the infinite always appears as something. But it's never the appearance of the infinite, it's rather the infinite discloses finitude. Now, that's philosophical. Let's flip it into architecture. How do we stop the fold unfolding ad infinitum? By recognizing that that's an algorithmic possibility, and it is an algorithmic possibility, no point arguing against that, but to see that as a way of talking about volume, of talking about surfaces, of talking about lots of things. Is it the same as talking about materials? Is it the same as talking about textiles? Is it the same as opting for one understanding of program apart from another? The answer is going to be no. What becomes interesting is the way the intersection of these things accepts the idea of the fold as an infinite, as operative, accepts that the idea that this has to be the case. But given that architecture has an ineliminable materiality, and the problem is always how do we create the material, it may be that the area of research that this prompts, I think this is the point, I will stop. The area of research that this prompts is not the one that allows the fold to unfold ad infinitum, to witter on simply about the virtual as though there weren't any such thing as actuality, to talk endlessly about potentiality as though it were not realized, but to work out what strategies of realization, of actualization, come from accepting the infinite as the ground of possibility, and then saying, all right, now we need to research precisely moments to avoid simple formalisms, whether modernist or blog formalisms, simple formalisms that allow for architecture to take on the quality of what I would want to call a material event. Thank you. Are there any questions? No, please. Okay. I don't mind. I'm easy. Okay. I'll have a large white wine, thank you.